Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. As I was doing some errands this morning, I had to stop and talk with a friend. He mentioned that he thought it seemed like I've been taking a long and somewhat meandering way to get to my destination. So I reminded him that I often do have to do that because I am so conservative. I have trouble turning left even when I'm driving. And there has to be a word of caution. This is not a safe place for those who may be easily offended by ideas that challenge their thinking. My name is Don Vino. This is broadcast number 65, and one of our board of advisors, Pastor Gino Geraci, is joining us to talk about moral fluidity and the church. My name is Don Vino again. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast.
Good evening from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, so we have 12 more months of winter. Our sponsors for tonight's broadcast include
12 more months of winter?
Well, I'm sorry, summer, whatever, you know. I just got here, right, Don? You know that? I'm sorry. The Designer Jesus collection. Say goodbye to unstylish Jesuses with the Designer Jesus collection coming to a church runway near you, and two great faiths that taste great together, Reese's Jesus Buddha cups. And of course, please, to ensure continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. So,
or as you feel led. As you feel led, give us a fee, give us a donation, click the button and make it big. And Gino Geraci, who's one of my favorite pastors, he's a pastor of Calvary Chapel, South Denver. And it seems to me a couple of things. One is you were mentioning you watched last week's program a little bit, and we're somewhat intrigued by transgenderism and transhumanism discussion. And we've also been talking a little bit about contemplative prayer and esoteric spirituality, which has nothing to do with what we're doing tonight. But you've been with Calvary Chapel for like way more than a week.
Yeah, I was one of those long-haired hippie people that got saved in March of 1973 at Calvary, Costa Mesa. So we were right in the thick of the Jesus movement, and so at the time I was quite literally a mystic and had been heavily involved in the occult and paranormal adventures, if you will. So got saved wonderfully by God's grace and mercy and love. And I've been with Calvary Chapel. I was with Skip Heitzig at Calvary Albuquerque for about 7 years. He and I went to high school together. And then I came here to Denver, where Ron Hensel, we saw 97% of the eclipse yesterday.
Wow.
In 1992, and we're going to be celebrating our 25th anniversary in October as a church by God's grace and mercy.
It's we've done some conferences down there, and Gino has been very gracious host to us. And he's one of our advisory board members. He's one that tries to keep me a little in line, and sometimes it is difficult. But tonight we're kind of touching on a topic. We did our blog last week was on moral fluidity. And for some reason, this has really captured my imagination, in part because over the years, as we have talked in conferences and been asked questions on roundtable discussions on where culture is going, I recall over 2 decades ago that question came up, and one of the things my wife Joy said is where we see culture going. This was at that time kind of shaking off Judeo-Christian morality. She thought, and I thought, and she predicted that gay marriage would probably be legal within the next 20 to 25 years. And lo and behold, it has become legal. Something else that began happening that we're caught a little off guard by was something now called gender identity. And so we've gone from male-female marriage to same-gender marriage. Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, is saying that male-female marriage is not a Chicago value, which I think surprised a lot of Chicagoans. So we've gone from that to now saying, well, if you wake up and you feel like a girl, you can, as a high school student, start using the girls' shower room. That was a mere 4 years ago or so. And it started here in this area, actually, Palatine, Illinois, the Palatine School District, when the Obama administration, the Department of Education said, either you let him do that or we withdraw your funding for your high schools. And so it became a major issue that some of the churches in that area were trying to fight against. And then almost overnight, it seemed like we had this new thing called gender identity. It wasn't just transgender. Now you have on Facebook 71 or more gender identities you could claim. So we have, it seems like, this moral fluidity going on. Last week on our blog, we had talked about how a 6 or 7 year old can now choose their gender. They somehow are sophisticated enough to do that. Why couldn't they just choose who they want to have sex with at that age? And someone wrote in and said, well, how did they put it that how can I say it? Start as an anatomically female may feel like a boy, but this child is still pubescent. I can imagine no scenario where a trans child suddenly feels like an adult at the age of 6. And so they're arguing that they really can't make choices of who to have sex with, but they can argue they can choose what sex they want to be, what gender they want to be. Is there something wrong with that? Am I missing something in there? Am I just dense in what he's saying?
Well, I asked you before about the difference between gender fluidity and relativism from an ethical, philosophical standpoint. And I think we're making a mistake when we just simply, because with relativism or moral relativism, it really becomes a form of amorality or immorality. And it's, especially when it's culturally driven. So you've got these two competing worldviews of absolutism and relativism. And I think part of the challenge is that when we buy into cultural relativism, that we allow the culture to determine what's right or wrong, people will make arguments that it's the culture that defines it. So imagine you're in Saudi Arabia and they're not enlightened concerning gender fluidity. They're not enlightened concerning same-sex marriage. They're not enlightened over homosexuality. And so they throw them off of roofs and they do this and that, and they determine that it's culturally driven. I think you have to have a conversation of how, once again, we think about rightness and wrongness.
I agree with that. We have to have that conversation. It seems to me the church has to lead the way in that conversation. The church doesn't really have currently the numbers that it seems to think it has out there. That's one of the things that I have to keep coming back to. There's a book I'm going to recommend. We haven't done a show on this, but The Great Evangelical Recession. John Dickerson, right? And he's saying 6 factors that will crash the American church and how to prepare. And as he goes through the factors, one of the things he points out is, there's this idea that there's 40% of the population are evangelicals or Christian. And it's just not true. As he compares all of the major studies including those by non-believers, by believers, George Barna and so forth, the numbers are really like 7 to 8.5%. It's under 10%.
Oh, I get. I would not make the argument. Oh, we're a moral majority, and that we have the impetus to be able to assert a moral majority viewpoint or a biblical worldview. I mean, obviously, we as Christians have a responsibility to represent a biblical worldview, but we also have to concede that we live in a culture that has already made the decision, Ron, that sexual expression trumps every other freedom, and including religious freedom. One of the guys, maybe you've heard about, his name is Jack Phillips. He frequents our church here. He is the baker who refused to bake a homosexual wedding cake. They fined him $160,000, Ron. A man was convicted of child sexual assault in North Carolina. They found him guilty and they fined him $16,000. We live in a world where in our culture, it seems reasonable to fine a pedophile $16,000, but a Christian who refuses to bake a homosexual wedding cake $160,000. But again, so we have to, I think we need to begin with a big question and then parse the bits and pieces.
Okay. And what is the big question that you want to say we should begin with?
I think the big question is about relativism versus absolutism. Is there such a thing as morality? Is there, because remember, when we use the term moral, we mean acting in a way that is right or wrong.
Right. Well, even like our questioner from last week agrees that there are morals. Moral relativists, as far as I can tell, still believe in morals. They just believe that they are changing and situational. They are different from person to person, culture to culture, time to time.
Right. And what I would argue is that's nonsensical. The reason why it's nonsensical, because if you're a moral relativist, what you are in effect saying is that you're the caretaker of what constitutes right and wrong. And so when we ask and we answer the question, if there's an absolute standard, and we look at what the absolute standard produces, like Jesus, like Mother Teresa, and then we look what the relativist produces, sociopaths. In other words, imagine you hold out as the paragon of morality the person who says, I determine what's right for me.
Okay. Well, here's if I was a moral relativist, as this individual was, and I would ask the same kind of a question he asked, which would be this: well, wait a minute, you guys are saying you believe in the Bible and that morals are absolute, they're not relative, and yet we find in the Old Testament polygamy, David, Solomon, and so forth. And that was clearly after Adam and Eve was created. So if you want to argue that God said one man, one woman, how do you account for polygamy other than to agree or affirm that morals indeed are relative? How would you respond to that?
I'm willing to let Ron have a little bit of a shot here, but I have something that I would say. But go ahead.
You're asking about. You're saying, can you restate the question, Don, about polygamy?
Sure. In the Old Testament, we find polygamy practiced seemingly without a problem by David and Solomon and others. That was after Adam and Eve were created. So to argue that God created one man, one woman from the beginning seems nonsensical. It must be relative and changing with times and places and cultures, because after all, God doesn't seem to have a problem with it.
Well, I go to the argument of Jesus. He was not dealing with the subject of polygamy. He was dealing with the subject of divorce when he said it was not so from the beginning, going back to Adam and Eve. And he basically established the principle that it was one man, one woman, joined until death do they part at that point. And he also said in that context, he explained the reason why God permitted divorce. It was because of the hardness of their hearts. So we have God overlooking sin. God has priorities. He is establishing, or he's moving his plan of salvation along, and he is tolerating certain kinds of things, such as polygamy and divorce. It's really stated clearly by Jesus that God accommodated or tolerated because of the hardness of their hearts. So what is this rule, this interpretive rule that Jesus gives? That is, what was it from the beginning? What kind of relationship was it? It was one man, one woman, and it was till death do they part.
Right.
What God has joined together, let no man
put
asunder.
So what the Bible describes doesn't necessarily mean it's what it prescribes.
Right. That's exactly right. And so the very fact that polygamy is mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean it's an affirmation of polygamy. Now, so we could ask a different question. Well, why doesn't the Bible specifically condemn polygamy? And what I would argue is, well, the Bible does condemn polygamy. It's seen as an acquiescence, I think, to protect women. In other words, in times of war and difficulty, and particularly in a culture and a society where women aren't valued, and that they had very limited options, that sometimes polygamy became the best way to protect a woman from further insult and injury. But also what I would argue is that, again, is the absolute standard one man, one woman forever? Yes. Is there a concession that, guess what, God's best and God's highest in a broken and a sinful world isn't always possible? And then we go back to the story that's told in John's gospel about the woman taken in adultery. Clearly, the proscription for adultery was death by stoning.
Right.
But yet, so when Jesus says to the men who are getting ready to stone her, "You who are without sin, let him cast the first stone." And you remember the story. They left from the oldest to the youngest. And then Jesus looks at the woman and says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "They're gone." And he says, "Neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more." Some people have read that to think, well, Jesus is soft on sin. He's just overlooking it. He's just letting it go. What they forget is that within 2 weeks, he's going to die on a cross for sin. So to suggest that Jesus is soft on sin is an inaccurate way. But we go back to the absolute versus the relative. Are there things that apply everywhere, every time, under every circumstance?
Right. So are morals objective? And
are they objective and absolute, or are they subjective? If they are absolute, who determines these absolute standards? And if they're subjective, now we get to the big question that you just talked about. Are they culturally driven, or are they individually driven, or is it some combination of the two? So that's where I would go with the conversation. Is it culturally driven if it's subjective? Is it individually driven? If it's
Penn Jamin, one of the questions that Penn Jamin asked is what distinctions are there between absolute and objective? And I would say, in response to this, culturally driven is something that Dr. Frank Beckwith brings up, which I think is a really important element in the discussion. Is it appears that they are culturally determined, but in fact, most often they are the same absolutes, just practiced differently. And he gives the example of, for example, in India, They don't eat beef. Jains don't eat beef. They wear gauze when they sweep when they walk, so they don't step on the bug or inhale a bug. They don't eat beef. If you're a cow, you're in Fat City in India. You're doing well. But in America, we don't have a problem. We eat. McDonald's 100 gazillion served. We like our steaks and our burgers and our chops and so forth. And the problem is that we're seeing this wrongly. We're not asking why don't they eat meat. And the reason is because of their view of karma and reincarnation.
And the transmigration of souls, yes.
The transmigration of souls. So the truth of it is, in India, they don't eat grandma. They don't eat the cow because they don't eat grandma. And they think the cow is grandma. In America, we don't eat grandma. So in both cultures, we agree it's wrong to eat grandma. Now, some people would say, well, cannibals eat people, and that's true, but they don't eat grandma either. In other words, even cannibals don't eat relatives.
Right.
So it's the same value. It just works itself out differently in the culture because of how we understand the world.
That's exactly right. And what I would argue is that even if there were some merit to the cultural expression, will do different cultures express themselves differently morally? What I would argue is the very fact that they do it differently doesn't mean that there still isn't an objective absolute. The very fact that different cultures might misinterpret or misapply it doesn't make it any less true. But again, what we have to ask is, well, what would be the evidence that there's an absolute standard?
Well, the evidence would be the Bible.
That's exactly right.
It's like as I read Penjamin's question, he's asking also about a distinction between the absolute and the objective.
Right.
The absolutes would be constant, unchanging, applied exactly the same in every circumstance. Objective simply, well, I'm not sure. He appeals to WLC, who I have to assume by whom he refers to as William Lane Craig.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm pretty confident that that's what he means.
Probably.
We would need to find out what does William Lane Craig mean by the word objective. If he means that morals have an independent existence apart from God, I would say no. If God didn't exist, would morals still exist objectively, or would we be left with simply subjective morals? I would say we have no choice but to assume that we would only have subjective morality if God did not exist and did not reveal his will to us, his laws to us. But we do have objective morality because God exists, and because this morality is a reflection of his being
and his character. Yes,
being, his character, who he is, what he is like. So they exist, in a sense, they exist in him. And so really, if you deny the existence of God, it's virtually impossible to establish objective morality. And if you have a God who is like the God of the deists, who doesn't really reveal himself other than very generally through nature, but does not give special revelation, well, you're going to have, there is going to be some, potentially at least, common grace that if this deistic God is willing to extend common grace to his creatures, if he hasn't revealed himself, then how do we know what he's doing? But the God of the Bible, we're dealing with the God of the Bible. Yes, there is objective morality. Now, in terms of absolute unchanging, some good Christians debate over this, conservative evangelical Christians, but not in very many areas. In fact, there's really only one area I can think of, and that's how do ethics apply in wartime?
Mm-hmm.
Is it wrong to lie to your enemy who's trying to kill you, to deceive the enemy in any way? when the Israelites were told to attack the city of, I believe it was Ai.
It was
Correct me if
first
I'm wrong.
Jericho. Yeah, it was Jericho. And the harlot, Rahab, hides them and lies about their position.
Well, yeah, she tells a direct lie, but I was thinking of the situation in which they were told to start coming at the city and then fall back. It was basically a move of military deception that they were commanded to employ. They were out there to deceive the enemy. You have it in what is it, Second Kings, when God, the prophet sees God on his throne saying, who will go forth, which spirit will go forth and be a lying spirit to deceive the prophets? And it's like God sends a deceiving spirit in a situation of spiritual warfare. We have Rahab the harlot lying in a life or death situation involving warfare. So when it comes to, is there a war ethic? Well, the Ten Commandments say you shall not kill. We translate that you shall not murder in modern translations, because we believe that the context of Scripture shows that there are times when you kill.
Right. There's an element, Ron, of justification, and that becomes one of the big things that are added to this issue. It is justification. And so we ask the question, when are we justified in taking a person's life? But this is the commonality of the moral. The moral is, by and large, human beings know it is wrong to murder a person without justification. And
okay,
so they'll argue that issue of justification.
I want to bring something up here, because Hunter Davis says that serial killers have morals. So as long as we're kind of on this topic of killers and morality, I would concur that serial killers have some sort of morals. I would also suggest that we can tell more about what someone believes by how they react than how they act. So a serial killer, for example, might justify what they're doing, or act in some way that is inconsistent with a good morality. But if you do something to them, their first reaction is, you have wronged me. So we can tell what they actually really believe by how they react, better than by how they act. Now, do you have any comments on that? Because then I want to lay out a kind of a quick setup and then have a short break.
Well, again, my comment would be the sociopath is the perfect example of a person who acts out their deeply held convictions, especially when it's based on, I'm going to do what I want. That's the very definition of sociopathy. What do you want to do? Whatever I want.
Right. That's pretty much what they do. But that becomes a morality of their own then, because anything that violates their sense of morality, they become angry about. Okay, let me kind of set up a quick scenario here, because it was not all that long ago, 2 decades ago, that we viewed same-gender relationships as immoral. The DSM, the Psychiatric Manual, DSM Manual, from 1952 to 1973 classified it as a mental illness. And then they withdrew that. In 1998, the American Psychiatric Association published a paper by 2 psychologists who argued that child molestation is only bad if the child feels bad. The only reason a child would feel bad is because culture makes them feel bad, because they talk negatively about these relationships. And so they recommended that we start speaking in more affirming language, adult-child sexual relations, for example. That was in 1998. That became really quite public in 1999. There was a big stir. Dr. Laura Schlesinger, us, and several others had dealt with that. In this book, I had mentioned the Great Evangelical Recession. He talks about students who are learning counseling, learning psychiatry, psychology, counseling, and how that when it comes to dealing with the issue of homosexuality, they have been told that they may be harming their client if they try to change their sexual bent. In fact, they are being punished for that. In 2007, the American Psychiatric Association, who once defined it as a mental disorder, they said you may be causing harm to the client, and then they would expel the students or bring about some remediation. And he writes this: it sounds sensational, but it might be 4 decades from now that the DSM includes a new mental illness, homophobia, ? That sounds like conjecture, right? I thought so until I stumbled on a 2003 article in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry. The journal article suggests that racism, sexism, and homophobia all be formally classified in one new DSM category as, quote, intolerant personality disorder. Now hold on to that. That's 2007. In 2012, and still going on today, so this is 5 years later, we have the beginning and growth of erotic zoos, which I'm looking at an article here, erotic zoos in Germany, after new law fails to ban bestiality. So we have a growing trend with bestiality brothels, which are growing in Germany, Denmark, and other places. Gino, comment?
Yeah, bestiality is disgusting. Homosexuality is disgusting. If you use the biblical definition, there's a word that's used in the Old Testament. It's the word abomination. Ron, I don't know if you know about the Hebrew of that word, abomination, but it's a word that expresses the most amount of disgust that you can muster in that culture. And again, I think what I would argue again is that we live in a broken world where people act out sexually in a number of ways that are prohibited by God, that I think the Bible prescribes as harmful. It isn't just immoral, it is harmful. Certain cultures have made certain harmful behaviors illegal, not just immoral, but illegal. To your point, are there cultures that are making harmful acts legal? And I think that the answer is, of course, yes. In the article that you sent me, the one that you just said about the bestiality, the big difficulty that people had was the harm that it does to animals. They don't make a moral judgment concerning the sexual act itself, but rather the harm that it might bring upon the animal. And so again, I think fair-minded people who don't have any kind of biblical literacy or commitment to biblical integrity, they would ask a different question. They would say, what are the chances that this behavior is going to harm the child? Now, again, I would go one step further and say there's a reason why the prohibition has been given against homosexual behavior. There's a reason why there's a prohibition against extramarital sexual behavior. There's a reason why bestiality is forbidden in the Old Testament, just like witchcraft and speaking with the dead and channeling spirits. Now, again, people might not necessarily apply a moral equivalency to assaulting a child, assaulting an animal, and trafficking in interdimensional beings. There's a reason why the Bible gives a blanket prohibition, because there's something wrong with that behavior. Somehow it offends God, but it also harms the people who participate in the activity.
Just
okay,
a comment.
And Ron, we need to take a break here. Quick.
Sorry.
And then you can jump in.
Then I can jump in.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to our break. Yes. So say goodbye to the days when your church's Jesus was a source of social embarrassment. Now, even your church can keep pace with the latest fashion-forward trends in spirituality. Introducing this collection. These amazing new Jesus styles are hitting church runways in the most exclusive Jesus fashion shows at churches near you. You don't want to miss Yoga Jesus, Hipster Jesus, Buddy Jesus, Socialist Jesus, and of course, Mormon Jesus. Please observe the attendance requirements for cost of admission and required attire. All proceeds benefit His Royal Majesty of the Kingdom of Darkness. The Designer Jesus Collection, London, Paris, Rome, New York, Salt Lake City. You don't want to miss it. So,
okay, now Ron, jump in.
Now, you were noting how the DSM went from 1973, I think it was, when they finally...
the 1950s, yeah. But then it goes fast forward.
Yeah, they finally declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. And now they're talking about, or have they already done it, classified homophobia as a mental illness?
They are talking about classifying homophobia as a mental illness.
I think this demonstrates very clearly, by the way, it puts it in bold relief, if you will, the fact that our culture is dictating the terms of science right now, what's called science. And that because of this, because our cultural values are upside down and inside out and the reverse of what they should be, so also is our science. The truth is, gender is not a social construct.
It's a biological construct.
It's a biological construct. It's a divinely made construct. You can come and you can change the definition of the word. And as I've stated here, not everybody totally agrees with me, but the really smart people do, that the gender now, where it used to refer to the sex that you are, now it refers to the sex you want to have. It makes some reference to the kind of sex you want to have, whether it's sex with a same-sex person, sex with multiple people, the kinkiest kind of sex you can think of, whatever it is. Gender is being redefined. They should really come out, instead of saying, this is what gender is, they should say, if they were honest, if they were good people doing righteous things, they would say, well, we've redefined the term gender to fit our preference. They're not honest people. We're not dealing with honest people anymore. We're dealing with deceptive people. And so they've just changed.
Right. And in some ways, gender is being even broken off of sexual relations altogether. We talked a little bit last week about Martine Rothblatt, who used to be Martin Rothblatt, went through sexual biological reassignment. And is now Martine Rothblatt. It's a name that's not familiar to most people, although they should be, because she's the founder of Sirius Radio, quite wealthy, and is involved also with transhumanism, the idea that we will get to the point where we can kind of download ourselves into computers and exist there eternally. And she wants to move toward a sexless, genderless society.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but that's still the kind of sex that he or she or it does or doesn't want to have.
Correct.
You know, so it's so what I started out saying is that gender is not a social construct, but non-organically based mental illnesses are social constructs.
Yeah, Caitlyn Jenner recently said, "I am not mentally ill." This is who used to be Bruce Jenner, who, I don't know how old you are, Ron, but I remember in 1976 when he won the gold medal, and he was on the cover of Wheaties as I'm eating the cereal in front of me. But again, what you see all of these things have in common is a fundamental denial of the revelation. And I, again, without sounding like a Bible thumper, but when the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, again, the disconnect is, no, a Big Bang created reality. God made them male and female. No, he didn't. Sex is an artificial construct. God ordained marriage. No, he didn't. It's not a spiritual event. It's a social construct which is available in whatever way you want it. So remember, moral truths are no more than subjective feelings about behavior in the culture in which we live. I think the thing that really rushed us forward, believe it or not, wasn't just falling off an absolutist bandwagon. It was Will and Grace on TV. All of a sudden, our culture as a whole starts watching TV, and they start watching Will and Grace, and they see people in normal settings, and they decide, who am I to judge them? Who am I to make a statement concerning their sexual behavior? And what they did is the culture as a whole has adopted a subjective relativistic viewpoint. And so
I think I would go back to Three's. I would go back to Three's Company myself.
Oh yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Three's Company.
And it wasn't because actual homosexuals are being portrayed. It was because it made us laugh about homosexuality. It made homosexuality the object of humor. Jack Ripper, I think, was that his name? The character's name?
Yes.
In any case, he was pretending to be gay so that he could. Now, so really, what you. Yeah, and he was always trying to, trick some woman into having sex with him. So you had really the worst of both worlds. You had, we were laughing at both fornication and homosexuality, which is the place where our culture had come to by the late 70s.
Right.
And so now you fast forward to what you just said again about childhood and the making the scientific decision based on a cultural acknowledgement. So again, you're wrapping this in science, saying it's okay to molest children. So someone has to say that's wicked, that's wrong, it's evil. And so far, at least in a few places, it's still criminal behavior. If you molest a child, we're going to find you, we're going to arrest you, and we're going to incarcerate you. But so now, where do you draw the line again? Are there people who are still holding out saying, I don't think sexually assaulting a child is a good idea?
Well, yeah, there are some. There's a group in California in the 1980s that their theme was sex before 8 or it's too late. So there are groups of people who do hold to that. Now, Hunter Davis, who's joined us, says if you grew up as Vikings, you wouldn't think killing, raping, and looting is immoral, and he's absolutely right. Vikings, however, did not have a Judeo-Christian worldview, and so their measurement of right and wrong was somewhat different.
Sure, pagan and polytheistic.
Right. He also then argues that morals are subjective. My morals are different than yours. They only appear subjective, as I said earlier. You can tell more about what someone believes by how they react than how they act. Now,
and I think again, take it one step further. If the Viking says looting, pillaging, raping is a good idea, but if you loot another Viking, pillage another Viking, rape the Viking's wife, would they find that acceptable or unacceptable behavior?
Retribution would come because it is wrong.
Yeah. Well, and also, morals are subjective only if there is no God. I just have to underscore that. I mean, in the ultimate sense of being subjective, and as you point out, Don, one way we know they're objective is because of the way people react. And I would say, yes, because that's evidence of the existence of God. Where can you go? Where can you find a culture where you'd find me one culture on the face of the earth, just one, where if you go and kill somebody's brother, that person will not be looking for some kind of recompense, some kind of revenge. find me one culture where that isn't the case. You cannot. It doesn't exist.
Greg Koukl used to say, to try and get to that bottom line, he would say, do you think it's ever a good idea to torture a child just for fun? Is there a culture that exists that goes, you know, it's our deeply held conviction that we are going to torture our children just to make us laugh?
And if you find an individual who does that, that doesn't mean you found a culture that does it.
Right. And, you know, there's a couple things that I probably need to interject here, because Christians are often accused of being judgmental on areas of sexuality and represented as taking a holier than thou attitude about this. And I don't really know any Christians that do the kind of was it Saturday Night Live church lady skit. I don't really know any. Yeah, it is funny stuff, but I don't really know anybody like that, actually. You know, everyone I know recognizes that we are all sinners subject to the same sorts of sinful desires and bad behaviors. To have a homosexual relationship is sexual sin. To have a male-female sexual relationship outside of marriage is fornication and is sexual sin. Having a relationship with someone other than your husband or wife, if you're married, is sexual sin. And we hold all of those as the same thing. Sexual sin, not any worse, really, on the grand scale of things before God than each other. Well, the possible exception of bestiality, I know that's kind of. What would you say about bestiality in society? How do you think that's going to go over here?
You know, what do you say, Ron? What do you say to that question? Yeah. How
about this? That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more.
He's quoting Popeye.
Well, yeah. You know, the Bible teaches something called common grace, and this, you know, what you're looking at in Romans 1, I noticed that Paul kind of stops short of bestiality in his list of sins that people are committing in Romans chapter 1. When he wants to show a culture that is really almost fully turned over to its own ways and its own devices, and common grace has been withdrawn to a certain degree, and it's never fully withdrawn in this life. There's no culture on the face of the earth that is so depraved and so down, you know, in its morality that God has totally abandoned it. God leaves a testimony of himself somewhere in the nature of these people. But when he wants to show it, he begins, frankly, with homosexuality. He says, this is about as far as you can get. When this becomes pervasive as a culture, you know that this culture has abandoned me, and I've turned it over to its own ways. And I notice he doesn't mention in that bestiality, although it does go on, it does occur. But I'm thinking of cultures like Greece and Rome, and even today, modern day Pakistan. Let's go there. There's a saying among Pakistanis, Pakistani men. Women are for making children, boys are for pleasure.
Right, pederasty. It's
it was practiced
term. And for centuries. It's entrenched in the culture.
Ancient Greece practiced this. You know, you got a wife so that you could procreate, have heirs, have offspring. But when you really wanted to have a good time, you found, you know, a young boy, and you had sex with him. That was practiced widely in Greek culture. Homosexuality has taken different forms in different cultures, but it is this is how you know things have really gone haywire.
Okay, so our theme tonight is moral fluidity and the church. So we're going to take just a short break and getting Ron a hands up, because I want to go and ask a couple of questions about the church and our response in church and in culture to what we see going on. Okay, Ron, you are on.
All right. Well, hold on one second. Okay. So one day, Rob Bell was walking along, not watching where he was going, and he smacked right into the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama says, "Hey, you got Christianity in my Buddhism." And Rob Bell says, "You got Buddhism in my Christianity." And then they decided that it's not all about truth, but experience. And isn't taste one of the best experiences? Two great faiths that taste great together. Reese's Jesus Buddha cups. You need to get them. Like you need a hole in the head. So we're back.
The Babylon Bee is of course a sarcastic website, which I love, I have to admit. And they had a meme of Rob Bell saying he's run out of essential doctrines to deny.
Yes.
He's been doing that for a while.
Well, he has. They may have borrowed that from Al Mohler, who was talking about Bishop John Shelby Spong, who and he said, well, he's denied all truth except his own existence, I think. So, so my question is kind of twofold. One is in the church, one is outside the church. I'll start outside the church and then ask you the question inside the church. Outside the church, what I don't find in Scripture are the early Christians marching around with banners telling everyone in the Greek culture to cease their behavior. What I find them doing is making a case for the Christian faith, for the, quote, unknown God, and that the Holy Spirit then transformed them as they became believers, which ended up transforming culture because of transformed lives. So it wasn't forced from the outside. The second question then is, how do we handle these issues within the church? We can clearly see that early church had troubles with that just by reading 1 Corinthians, where they were dealing with sexual sin within the church.
It sounds like what you're saying. Sounds like you're saying that Westboro Baptist Church doesn't go all the way back to the time of the apostles.
I would say no.
Are you suggesting that?
Yeah, okay. I am suggesting that. Yep. So Gino, as a pastor of a fairly reasonably sized church, you have. I'm asking the question from both aspects. Then, do you want your people outside in picketing gay weddings and that sort of thing, or
no?
What if someone who comes into your church is a same-gender couple? Should they be allowed to pass through your doors?
Of course they should. Just like heterosexuals pass through the doors with a whole boatload of difficulty. So the issue isn't whether or not they show up. The issue is, again, as a church collectively, we have to ask and answer a different question. Why do we exist as a church? We exist as a church to worship God and to disciple the saints and to reach the lost. I wish I could say, 33% of the time is spent in worship, 33% is spent in discipleship, and 33% is in evangelism. But that isn't always the case. If you can't worship God in spirit and in truth, then you're probably not going to be able to make disciples. And if you're not able to make disciples, you can't make disciples who will try to reach the lost in a winsome way. And so all of those kinds of activities should be taking place all at once. But again, we have to ask ourselves what the question that you had proposed, and that is, what is the most important thing at this point? Is it an expectation that sinners are going to act like saints? No. We have a responsibility to give the gospel to people who are lost, to share Christ with them. Now, again, going to what you talked about in Corinthians, but Paul has a reasonable expectation for those people who identify themselves as Christians to act like Christians, to act responsibly in the culture as people who have been saved by the Lord Jesus Christ. Understanding, if we talk about a broken culture, Corinth is that broken culture. And what's interesting is Paul actually refers to them as saints. And so, you know, what are we to do? We're salt and light. The Roman Empire was transformed, I'm going to suggest to you, by the gospel. Some people forget, in the 3rd century, in the middle of the 2nd century, actually, slavery was abolished. Do you know why slavery was abolished? Not because of Christians and Christianity. They were experiencing an economic disaster of catastrophic proportions, and the Emperor Diocletian freed all of the slaves. He was a person who was trying to reinvest in paganism. But do you know why he freed all of the slaves? Because slaves didn't pay taxes. The moment he freed them, he doubled the economic base of the empire. But Christians in Christianity treated slaves as human beings who could be saved by the power of the Holy Spirit. Remember, this is a culture where slaves are considered tools. Mm-hmm. Sometimes Christians consider non-Christians as tools.
That's really important. I want to tell a story because this is how it has worked out in my life. I have, as you have said, I wish Christians would act like Christians. Too often we see them behaving as badly or worse than we see unbelievers acting. Hunter Davis asked the question, I'm just trying to say, or he says, why can't we just all coexist? And I think that's a fair question. Why can't we just all coexist? I don't believe that it's our job to judge non-believers. And I think Paul says that. He says, I don't judge those outside the church. I judge those inside the church. So we need to deal with sin inside the church. And as we spoke earlier, if you were preaching through a passage and you came to the subject of sexual immorality, you would address sexual immorality regardless of what gender is involved here, right? It's just sin.
That's exactly right.
Some years ago, I was, as you know, I was in construction for 40 years. I was a construction manager 25 of those years. And at one point, I had a client who had a designer that was gay. And he asked me if I would work with him. And I said, in jest, I said, sure, I'd work with him as long as he doesn't ask me for a date. I think we'll get along fine. And then I went to meet with him. And on my way, we were supposed to go somewhere. He called me and he said, I will drive. Now, I know the reason he made that call was because he was uncomfortable. He knew I was a Bible banger. I'm a Christian. And he's going to be stuck in a car with me. And he didn't want me to go all Christian on him while we were going to wherever. And so he would have control of the car. He would have control of the radio. What he didn't realize is we're in Chicago. He doesn't have control of the traffic. And so I got in the car. And as we headed off to where we're going, immediately we got into a traffic jam, an hour and a half. After a few minutes of this traffic jam and silence in the car, he said, did the client let you know that I am gay? And I said, he did. He said, do you have a problem with that? I said, as long as you don't ask me for a date, we'll get along fine. And he kind of snickered. Now it's kind of fun. He goes, well, don't you think it's wrong? I said, of course, it's sin. I said, but Bible tells me there's a lot of things that are sin. And it strikes me as interesting that homosexuality is kind of couched in between gossip and slander there. So it could be that gossip is actually worse than homosexuality, but it's still sin. And we ended up working together for 5 years. Now, I got a lot of opportunities to share the gospel with him. At one point, his home had been broken into. I live 30 miles away. He didn't call his next door neighbors who are also gay. He called this Bible-banging apologist that lives 30 miles away to come and help them because he didn't know what to do next. Why? They trusted me. Now, is that right or wrong? I think it's right. I think we have to coexist in a non-believing world. Comments?
I'm going to let Ron talk because I've been hogging the whole time.
Well, no, I think this is a huge misunderstanding. The very way, Hunter Davis keeps asking this question. He likes this word judgmental. Why can't we just coexist? He says. Well, who says we don't? I mean, to coexist. I mean, we Christians, we evangelical Christians, frankly, are not the ones who invented the idea that marriage is just for men and women. That wasn't our idea. I mean, it goes back way before us. It was there. We inherited this idea from previous centuries and centuries and centuries of tradition in every culture on the face of the earth. So suddenly, because we say, well, we think this is a good law to keep, now we're being judgmental, and we're not coexisting. Well, of course we're coexisting. We've been coexisting with gays for millennia. Are there people in these cultures who are mistreating homosexuals? Yeah, they are. Do they? And like you said, Don, sometimes Christians don't make a very good show of what we should be. I think I've strayed a little bit from your question, though, haven't I?
Well, not that far, Ron, because again, I think what we have to affirm, what we as Christians can do. We are ordered by the Bible to judge between right and wrong and good and evil. The Bible prohibits hypocritical judgments. The Bible prohibits judgments where we don't have all of the information, and so we're incapable of making a judgment, and we are forbidden from making judgments concerning sin when we're involved in that sin.
And there's a problem with the word judgment, and that is that it has a fairly wide range of meanings.
Correct.
There is judge in the sense of condemn. Okay, yeah, we condemn the sin. Why do we do that? Well, because we believe the Bible does it. We're just simply passing on the information here. The same Bible that condemns the sin of homosexuality condemns my sins. And apart from Christ, it would condemn me as a sinner. Now, there you go from condemning the sin to condemning the sinner. We don't condemn any sinner. We don't have the right as Christians to condemn anybody personally. We can say that, we're going to coexist with you guys all the way up to the end. And then there's going to be a separation. We're not going to do this. Jesus is going to come back and he's going to do it. He's going to put the sheep on one side and the goats on the other. And I'm here to tell you, at that point, coexistence is over.
Well, and I think we're back to the cultural imperative where we have individuals and we have a culture where the individual and the culture says, you know what? I want you to celebrate sin. And you go, no, the Bible says we're supposed to mourn sin. No, I want you to affirm that homosexual behavior is good and even I'm looking for a word and
it's admirable. It should be emulated. As Paul said, they not only practice these things, but they heartily encourage others to do so.
Exactly. So when a person says, not only do I want you to affirm that this behavior is right and good, I want you to celebrate it with me. And the Christian does have a responsibility to say, no, the Bible asks me to mourn sin. It asks me to celebrate righteousness. You're asking me to celebrate sin instead of mourn it.
Right.
And so I'm not going to do that. At that point, that's where we're back to the DSM, where you go, well, isn't that a type of mental or emotional illness? And
yeah,
I can imagine a culture that says that that's the case.
It's a good thing you brought that up, because I wanted to expand on what I said earlier. Gender is not a social construct, but non-organic diagnoses of mental illness are. And by that I mean, when homosexuality was defined as a mental illness, that was a social construct. And today, if they decide to define homophobia, what they call homophobia, as a mental illness, that will also be a social construct. Homosexuality is not a mental illness; it's a sin.
But
and
there's
so,
and that this is what makes it wonderful. If you want to use that term, it can be forgiven. It can be repented of. Sin can be repented of. Guess what? Mental and emotional distress can't be repented of.
So let's go on the record here, brothers, right? When they gave electroshock therapy to homosexuals to try to stop them from being gay, that was wrong.
Right.
You know, that was immoral, that was unethical, that was stupid. Okay, that was not what the Bible calls for. I don't know of anybody who endorses any kind of what do you call it? Conversion therapy.
Abuse. Yeah, conversion therapy.
Abuse.
Right.
That's abuse.
Or but we can even say abuse conversion. Yeah, that's not how.
Yeah, I don't know of anybody who's endorsing any kind of conversion therapy today that would include anything remotely like that as one of the techniques. So.
Well, you know, we have run over time again, which I don't have a problem with. Fortunately, we don't have the same kind of a clock that you have on radio, Gino. But kind of as a wrap up, it seems to me that the church and moral fluidity, which is really what we're experiencing, is sort of like a stream, is moving along and changing as it goes, sort of unchecked. I appreciate Hunter Davis having kind of dropped in and asking questions along the way. He does say he's not trying to judge Christians. He's judging humanity. In part, it seems like what he's saying is, why don't we just let everyone live however they want to live? But at the same time, he also agrees that it's wrong to have sex with children. So he gets that from some place. He does think that's wrong in some form or fashion. We call it sin. What we're saying is fairly straightforward. Within the confines of the church, we expect believers in the believing community to live a certain way. The morality that the Bible prescribes.
Not based on what Don Vino says or what I say or Ron says, but based on a revelation that's been given concerning what constitutes right conduct and wrong conduct.
Right. Now, having said that, we also recognize, and it is our task as leaders to remind believers on a regular basis how they ought to live and behave, and if they get out of line, to gently try to bring them to correction. If they are unrepentant, to bring them publicly before the church, also prescribed in Scripture, right? We, on the other hand, though, are not to be judgmental to those outside the church. And I appreciate, Ron, you made a difference between judging and being judgmental. I think that's a huge distinction. We're not supposed to show up to funerals and with signs like "God hates fags." I mean, that's just not our calling. God deals with the heart level as people come to the faith.
Yeah, it's the fact there was a book written which is not a very good book, but it has a good title. Actually, I would change the title though a little bit. The original title was "Is the Homosexual My Neighbor?" It was written by a woman who later came out as a lesbian, Virginia Ramey Mollenkott. Her brother, by the way, performed my wife's and my wedding ceremony. He is not a practicing homosexual. His sister is, but she wrote the book, "Is the Homosexual My Neighbor?" And I would retitle it, "The Homosexual Is My Neighbor." And because he is, or she is, I must love my neighbor as I love myself. I must seek the best for my neighbor. That means I want that person to have a good job. I want them to be clothed. I want them to be well fed. I don't want them to be discriminated against. And I want them to come to know Jesus. And I'm just going to say this: coming to know Jesus means stopping It means to stop being a homosexual, just like it means to stop being a fornicator, to stop cheating on your wife, to stop cheating on your income taxes, to stop telling lies, or whatever else you do that is against God's law. But I don't. My first task is to introduce the person to Christ. Homosexuality is not their biggest problem. Their biggest problem is they don't have Jesus. So that's where we start. And if the Lord chooses to convict them of other sins first, well, then the Lord sometimes does that. But when if it's really his conviction, then it will lead to everything else.
All right, and you know what? We're going to have to wrap it up. Gino, I think we're going to have to do some more of this in the future on something. It's been great having you here.
Thank you for coming.
And
well, Ron, thank you. I didn't get a chance to tell you, but I'm a fan. I read what you write, and it's been so very helpful over the years.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So.
Well, and in fact, we had just, I don't know if you saw this, but we had a comment from Penjamin that says that he loves our work on Gothardism, and that it might help Christians not retreat too far from hyper-conservatives or otherwise unhealthy congregations and overcorrecting.
Well, you and Don, you and Ron both have pointed out something in the wonderful work that you've done with Gothard. And that is Christians, leaders do not have the right to abuse and manipulate people. Right. That there's not one set of standards for one and another set of standards for another. And everybody watching who's ever been manipulated or abused, they know what that's like. And right. They know it's wrong. So it's because they're made in the image of God. And whatever it means to love a person, I've come to believe it means doing what's in their best interest. Now, for some people, they might think, well, it's in my best interest that you overlook my sin or pretend that it's not a problem. But according to the Bible, that's not the loving thing to do, to overlook sin or call sin something other than what it is.
Right. Amen.
And it's important for us to be clear in what we are trying to convey. It reminds me of a little joke. Two pastors standing by the side of a road with a sign that says the end is near. And the drivers come by and they honk their horns and they're giving them grief. And then you hear screeching brakes at the a half a mile down the road. And one pastor finally looks at the other and says, do you think we should change the sign to road is out? People sometimes overreact to what we're saying because they think that because we're unclear and they think we're saying something that we're not. We need to be clear in what we are talking about. Yes, homosexuality is sin, but so is gossip, lying, adultery. There's all sorts of sins that we all need to repent of. You brought up the woman caught in adultery and Jesus' response. And you're right. It isn't that he was not judging sin. In fact, he says to her, go and sin no more. As I read the story, it occurs to me he was being harsher on the hypocrites, the Jewish leadership, because they weren't doing it because of her sin. They were doing it to embarrass him.
Exactly. But whether it's hypocrisy or adultery, Jesus will go to that cross. He will die the death that both the hypocrite and the adulterer deserve, and he will come back to life. God is not soft on sin. It's going to have a severe punishment. And that's the very heart of the gospel. Right. That God wants to God has found a way to forgive us and to reconcile us to himself.
All right, so quickly before we go out of here, if anyone wants to contact Calvary Chapel to get questions, how would they do that?
They can go to the website at calvarycsd.org, calvarycsd.org.
Okay. And of course, if they want to contact us or contact you through us, they can go to our website, midwestoutreach.org. They can email us. Our phone number is there. They can call us, and we try to respond to all calls and emails, even ones from people who don't like us. Especially maybe ones from people who don't like us. Ron, you want to walk us out of here tonight?
Be glad to. This is how we roll the credits. Okay, our resident cult leader profiler is Neil. Before me, our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygumus. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issue coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Yvonne Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is wiretapping, and original idea sourcing comes from Drew Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, who are solely responsible for all of this content, but you'll never prove that in a court of law. So,
Ron, thank you. Gino, thank you.
Thanks,
Ron,
Gino.
we'll see you
Thanks,
next week.
Okay.